Pro Tour's murders at Markov Manor took place this past weekend with a couple of surprises that a murder mystery set seems apt to uncover. Pioneer had some preconceived notions that ended up getting ripped out of our heads almost immediately this weekend. Team Channel Fireball came out of the tournament winning Rakdos Vampires list, which Seth Manfield took the trophy using, while Lotus Field Combo filled the room more than expected, and Heroic Player of the Year took Burroughs in a different direction. Now, if you want to take a look at the metagame as a whole, Frank Karsten broke it down cleanly over on the official Magic website on Friday. However, I noticed a couple of different things that these lists were doing that will make my breakdown a little bit more different than the Wizards version that's already on their website. First off, I know that people who are watching this video are more looking at what cards in these decks were there rather than the statistical significance of a deck's overall presence in the metagame. So, because of this, I've chosen to break down the decks a little bit further based on specific card choices within each archetype. This means while their matchup spread will be a little bit lower, you'll have a better idea of what cards made those matchups better or worse. Secondly, I am pulling my data from Melee GG, which is missing a single list of the Izzet Phoenix archetype. Although my math is out of the 258 registered decks that the Magic website reported, there's one list that is not accounted for, so if my numbers are a teeny tiny bit different, it's because Melee's missing a list. Now, with all of that housekeeping out of the way, let's take a look at how I broke down the archetypes present at the latest Pro Tour. I saw a few trends with the deck lists as they appeared on Melee GG. First off, there was a distinct difference in Rakdos mid-range lists having Inti or not having Inti. Lists with Inti tended to favor Smuggler's Copter, while lists without Inti tended to favor Reckoner Bankbuster, and sometimes even went all the way up the curve to Aklazot's Deepest Betrayal. Secondly, the Lotus Field combo lists were actually slightly different takes on the deck we've seen previously. Some lists ran the normal combo list with very few creatures main deck besides Boreal Grazer and Lear, Disciple of the Drowned. Others ran Dragonlord Dramoka or Atraxa Grand Unifier in their main decks, while yet another subset ran Strict Proctor as another way to quote-unquote stifle their Lotus Field triggers. The majority of the Enigmatic Fires decks settled on running Karuga the Macro Sage as their companion of choice, but one list did decide on running Yorion Sky Nomad instead and went up to 80 cards in the main deck. Lastly, Izzet Creativity was the version we'd seen at Pro Tours past with Worldspine Worm and Xenagos God of Revels trying to kill someone in one big swing. However, there was one version that ran Torrential Gearhulk and Magma Opus instead, which I renamed to Gearhulk Creativity. Now with that in mind, let's take a look at the top 10 presence decks from Pro Tour Murders at Karlov Manor, and take a look at not just the share of the metagame, but their win rate as well. Starting from the top, Izzet Phoenix put up the third best performance of the top decks in win rate, despite having the most decks in the room by far. That usually works against your win rate by having so many decks. Goes to show that even with stock lists of Phoenix still the main choice at the Pro Tour, Pilot Skill and Delve cards go a long way. The fact that the deck can win games seemingly from nowhere thanks to Galvadic Iteration and Temporal Trespass makes it always a winnable angle for the Phoenix player if they pilot themselves into a clear. Now, Azoria's Control was arguably the biggest disappointment of the event, with only both normal Rakdos versions having a worse record in the top presence decks. Control decks did struggle to deal with the metagame's adaptations to it being on top for so long, while Amalia Combo's presence waned a bit and opened up the event to a slew of different decks than before. Speaking of both versions of Rakdos, I split it out in this way, and they wound up both having a bit of a rough weekend, with the Inti version of Rakdos midrange being the worst performing deck of the top presence decks. So while Smuggler's Copter has great synergies with Inti, decks at the Pro Tour were already there combating 2 mana cost cards from Amalia combo and the low mana threats from both Boros decks, so the larger version of the Rakdos deck performed slightly better, but not as good as the Bloodthirsty Brethren in Rakdos Vampires. Now, Amalia combo had a bit of a resurgence at this event, with the Pioneer metagame having a few more creature-based decks and a little less control. Amalia was able to explore its way to a win rate that was just under Izzet Phoenix from the top decks. Boros decks also put up great results at this event, with Boros Heroic and Boros Convoke both being some very high win rate decks and having a decent metagame share as well. These decks were low to the ground and fast to get underneath some of the combo and control decks, while the indestructibility of the heroic version gave it some extra long game against the Amalia decks. Breakout deck of the tournament with a 59.6% match win rate, which was the highest of the top presence decks and the 6th best of all the decks in the room at the PT, was Rakdos Vampires. As my friend called it, Sorin Tel attacked the Pioneer metagame in a two-pronged facet, which was extremely difficult for decks to adapt with on the fly. Izzet and Soul showed up in force and was a deck that I honestly thought was going to be a breakout deck for the Pro Tour, but it got upstaged by Rakdos Vampires. All in all, it did end up with a below 50% match win rate, so it wasn't as impressive as I was hoping it for it to be, but it did have its good matchups. At the end of the top 10 presence decks is the Dramoka version of Lotus Field combo, which, as you may recall, is just one of the 4 different types of Lotus Field decks that were at the Pro Tour. This version leveraged Archdruid's Charm to not only find its needed lands to combo, but also find Dragonlord Dramoka at instant speed to then untap and cast to lock your opponents off, so you can just combo away the next turn. Now, those were the top presence decks, but of course, I know everybody loves some nice spicy lists, so we're gonna switch focus and switch our gears here to the top 10 decks of the Pro Tour that were based off of win rate alone, regardless of how many decks were in the room. Right away, we already see some of these top presence decks in the top win rate bracket as well. Rakdos Vampires was the top performing deck based on its metagame share, while Boros Convoke, Izzet Phoenix, and Amalia combo all put up top 10 win rate performances as well across a double-digit amount of decks. The real story of the event, though, is Gabriel Nassif's 8-2 overall record with Dimir Control, completely putting my "Is Dimir Control viable in Pioneer" video to shame. Yellow Hat kind of took that notion, threw it out the window, and said, nah, I could play it. In all honesty, the deck looked amazing in Gabe's hands, but I'm still not convinced that it could just go to anybody's hands and dominate the meta the way that he did. The big standout with just one more match lost than Gabe was Ben Stark's Boros Burn deck, a white splash take on the mono-red decks that we've seen in previous iterations of Pioneer. This deck got new life breathed into it by the reprinting of Lightning Helix, and then the ability to sideboard into Get Lost, which was able to deal with consistent threats to the mono-red version like Shield or the Apocalypse in a much cleaner manner. Day 1 of LCI Boogeyman Quintoria's combo also had a pair of decks that entered the Pro Tour that combined 65% win rate, and the deck hasn't really seen very many changes, but it did wind up running Karuga the Macro Sage as a companion just to go with the high mana cost curve it needs to run for Quintorius. One version of Jeskai Control wound up going 6-4 in the Pioneer rounds, and while the Azoria's cousin version of the deck had a lower win rate at the Pro Tour, the Jeskai version was able to use Fable of the Mirror Breaker, Lightning Helix, Torch the Tower, and a pair of Regal Caracal Cats in order to take some games. The last list that topped the win rate charts with only a singleton copy was the Yorian Sky Nomad version of the Enigmatic Incarnation Fires of Invention deck. This 80-card version was able to run a one-of copy of 15 different creatures for all sorts of occasions and tutor them up at will. Now, let's not forget the 4 copies of a certain tricolor greasy rat that rose back into the win rate charts this Pro Tour. Abzan Greasefang got a couple of new tools, including Sentinel of the Nameless City to make map tokens, as exploring helps put cards in the graveyard, but it also synergized with Kaya Spirit Justice, a card from Murders at Karlov Manor, which can not only surveil and exile a card from graveyards, but turn those tokens into copies of Greasefang so that you can just soar into the skies and make those angels for GG. With a lot of the top presence decks also having top win rates, it's important to take a look at where those wins were coming from, so we can see if the deck was great as a whole, as a metagame call, or if it was a specific metagame call into certain matchups. The matchup matrix here will dig into where the decks took their wins against based on the top 10 presence decks, so you'll know if it's right for your local metagame or not. Izzet Phoenix, as the most played deck, did well against the other top 3 decks that were popular in the room, Azoria's Control, and both flavors of Rakdos midrange. It was not as great into Amalia and Boros decks, and it did struggle against the Dramoka Lotus Field decks. However, it matched up well into the other Izzet deck, Izzet and Soul, and was 50-50 against the tournament-winning Rakdos Vampires list. It's going to be hard to say that Phoenix isn't one of the best, if not the best deck in Pioneer, looking at the breakdown from this event, especially if Amalia combo and control decks continue to keep Boros Convoke numbers down lower. Azorius Control's poor performance wasn't just against some of the unknown decks like Rakdos Vampires, but it also struggled against Izzet Phoenix harder than we've seen it struggle at previous events. The level of player at the Pro Tour could be preying upon a weakness in the matchup that your average RC or MTGO League player might not be able to take the advantage of. Meanwhile, both the Boros decks also had an above 50% win rate against the deck. Surprisingly so, the Boros Convoke deck ended up being even higher than the Heroic version. Lastly, the Dromoka equipped versions of Lotus Field combo were better equipped at shutting down Control's counter magic, making it a rough tournament for this deck. The two different versions of Rakdos midrange didn't do the greatest at the Pro Tour, but there are differences in their matchup spread that might highlight which version of the deck you should be considering going forward, aside from just swapping to Vampires entirely. Decks running Inti were slightly worse into the Control and Convoke matchups, while they were also unable to get under the Lotus Field decks. Decks going larger were slightly worse against Amalia, Heroic, and Soul, and the Rakdos Vampires deck. Both versions were not great against Phoenix, and Control was slightly favored for the larger Rakdos versions, so it seems like slowing down gives the Rakdos deck more options for the combo decks, but the slower clock can be an issue in some matchups. Now adjust accordingly to what your playstyle may be, as well as what your local metagame looks like if you plan to bring a normal, bloodless sucking version of Rakdos to Pioneer Nights. Amalia combo was better than expected, putting up winning Phoenix, Rakdos midrange, Convoke, and Lotus combo matchups. While Boros Heroic had a winning match record into the deck, it wasn't the quote-unquote hard counter that you might expect it to be, with Amalia hovering around a 43% win rate, which is actually very similar to its win rate against Azorius Control at this event. Speaking of Boros Heroic, the deck put up great results into Amalia, Phoenix, and Control, but it did struggle against all flavors of Rakdos and their plethora of both removal and hand disruption. Otherwise, the deck could have been the breakout of the tournament with the way that its matchup spread wound up working out, as it did have higher win rates across the board than I think a lot of people were anticipating. Boros Convoke, in a similar vein, beat up on the top of the metagame decks, except for the Amalia combo decks. Turns out blowing up the entire board from the deck that just wants to flood the board with creatures is pretty bad for that deck. It also lost all of its matches against Boros Heroic in the head-to-head, quote-unquote, which Boros deck is best matchup. But with only 4 matches here at the Pro Tour, I'm not sold that it means Heroic is strictly favored in that matchup. Rakdos Vampires also beat it 3 out of the 5 matches that they played at the Pro Tour, so the Convoke deck preys on the top of the metagame but might struggle against everything else. Izzet and Soul failed to put up the best results against the top of the metagame decks, with its best win rates coming against the bigger version of Rakdos midrange and against Amalia combo, but it was only a 50% win rate overall. While the deck can be fast, it stumbles when it can't get going due to bad draws or good interaction from opposing decks, making it a toss-up against decks like Lotus Field combo that just kind of goldfish it. Rakdos Vampires rode an even or better matchup against all of the top decks all the way to a Pro Tour trophy. With such a positive matchup spread against the field, Pioneer decks are going to have to adapt to a 6-5 on turn 3 with hand disruption to land it on time. If you can get your hands on the Sorens and the Rippers, this deck is going to be one to take to an event soon before the metagame can properly adapt to it. Dromoka Lotus Field decks put up results against the 2 decks it was seemingly built to combat, both Izzet Phoenix and Azorius Control, and it had the upside of beating up on the Inti Rakdos midrange decks, but did struggle against the bigger version and the Vampire flavor of the decks, although there was only 1 matchup against the Vampires deck that was played. The aggro decks, however, were the downfall of Lotus decks, as the aggro decks have historically been too fast for the combo deck to beat. That's how the Pro Tour shook out in Chicago, so what do you think about Pioneer right now? Are you excited to rip some veins? Are you happy to dust off the Lotus Fields and Defiant Strikes that you put on the shelf more recently? Let me know in the comments below what you're thinking about bringing to your local game store, and make sure to tap that subscribe button to stay up to date on my latest metagame analysis, deck techs, and just in general Magic content. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you later.